Welcome to Simcast, a podcast brought to you by the Society for Imaging Informatics and Medicine.
Welcome to this episode of Simcast. Today we're going to be talking about monitors. Now I know it might not be as sexy as AI, but given how long we spend staring at these suckers, we figured it's probably a good idea that we finally got around to recording an episode. With us on this Simcast is Jeff Frimeth and Herman Oosterwijk. Jeff is president and chief medical physicist for JF Medical Physics. He's a diagnostic radiological medical physicist specializing in working with facilities in establishing, maintaining, and improving image quality and radiation safety. Jeff is a member and active volunteer with the American Association of Physicists in Medicine, on the board of directors for the American Board of Magnetic Resonance Safety, and current president of the PACS Administrators Registry and Certification Association. Herman is a healthcare imaging and IT consultant specializing in connectivity for AI applications. He has published several textbooks and study guides on healthcare imaging standards and has served on committees for DICOM, HL7, and HIMSS. He has taught about standards and PACS in more than 20 countries and volunteered in Latin America and Africa installing PACS software. And of course, Herman has been on the podcast multiple times before. We really were excited for recording this and hope you guys enjoyed as much as we did. And welcome to this episode of Simcast. I've been hoping to get some people to talk about monitors for some time now, and we have Herman and Jeff here, so I'm very excited. It's something we use every day in our business as radiologists and informaticists, but we don't really talk about it as so much, and it's very important to understand some of these things, why some things are rules and why things are recommendations, and hoping to delve into many other aspects of monitors. I know Herman and Jeff have some things that they wanted to kind of start rolling with, so I'll turn it over to you guys. Herman, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you, Prasad. Yeah, when I talk about monitors, I always like to start a little story, and that goes back into a long time ago, actually 1990s or so, when a radiologist was looking at an image. I think it was on the northwest coast somewhere, and he looked at this image and he said, "Gee, I could have sworn that I've seen a cancer a year ago. It's gone. I don't see anything. What's happening?" So that actually started the whole process, or the whole focus on monitor quality and representation of images. And we in PACS and informatics guys, we were not listening to the physicists. We were talking for many years to say, "Yes, guys, you need to take care of these monitors. You need to do something about it." But that was actually the direct input that caused the DICOM committee at that time, say, "Listen, we need to come up with a standard." So that's how the whole standardization of monitors started. And what does the standard mean? The standard means that there is a one-to-one relationship between pixels, grayscale values, and something that can be perceived on a monitor. Now, this is critical. Something that can be perceived on a monitor, because, you could potentially, put different pictures on monitors, but if none of the observers can really see any differences, right, it's still useless. So they mapped really the human visual system. And there was actually a scientist at the time, Dr. Barton, that's why we call it sometimes the Barton curve at UNC, who actually had mapped earlier the whole human visual system. Basically, he asked us, he had a pizza morning on Saturday morning, and he said to the students, "Come in, and I want you to sit in front of a monitor. I'm going to change the output, and you need to tell me when you see a difference." So we mapped the pixels to just noticeable differences. And that became the DICOM standard, and it became really the foundation that a medical grade monitor today is built upon. So, Jeff, anything to add here?
No, thank you, Herman, and thank you, Mohanad and Prasant, for inviting me today. So as Herman said as well, yeah, with displays, we really want calibration is sort of a key word that always comes up when we talk about this discussion point. And the key aspect of calibration is to ensure, can we get and how do we get a consistent look for the same image across the same display and multiple displays over time? So that's really what it boils down to. And then, as Herman nicely put, we get into how the calibration works in terms of the DICOM and Barton model and things like that. So maybe eventually we can go down the rabbit hole there on this podcast. But calibration is something, as a medical physicist, I'd say one of my primary concerns when I visit either a clinic, a hospital. We actually do a lot of home radiologists as well, mostly in mammography. Just an extension of that, like I said, calibration is something that I look at in particular, but it's also the ambient light settings. So does a radiologist work in a haunted house with zero light at all or very minimal light? Is there too much light? We get asked questions about, is there a sweet spot? Can I work, in a pitch black environment because I don't like too much light? It causes too much strain on my eyes. So these are sort of the questions that we sort of get asked clinically in a work setting. And usually my answer is I always like to refer to a standard whenever possible. So there's a nice standard and it's free online. I'm sure most of us know about it. And it's the ACR AAPM SIM electronic standard for medical imaging, and probably missing a word or two. But in that standard, they have a lot of different stuff, including what the settings are for the ambient light, calibration, and things like that. So as an extension of that, I always like to say you always should never read inside a haunted house. So I'd like to put a comedic spin on it, let's say, but also just to increase the room brightness a little bit. Speaking in terms of practical terms, you really should be able to see if you're moving from your display, look at your keyboard, look around the room a little bit. There should be some sort of surrounding light so your eyes don't really have to adapt that much overall. And it does overall reduce the amount of visual strain on the radiologist. And my argument, and it's more anecdotal and more of a thought process, is that if you're decreasing your visual strain, then you're probably making yourself a more effective and efficient radiologist.
I like to talk a little bit about this calibration because calibration is needed. Why? Because monitors degrade. First we had the CRT monitors and the phosphor would degrade, and then we had the backlight. And I always compared, look at these fluorescent lights in the ceiling in your office. You can see after 2 years, 3 years, they became not as bright anymore. And there was the same technology we used in these backlight, but now the same with LED. So monitors degrade over time. What means that is that what you see today is not what you see next week, next year, and a couple of years from now. As a matter of fact, there will be an end of life purely because the light output, is not sufficient enough to map all these different grayscale values into a range that is acceptable. So calibration is key. And in the early days, I don't know if there's any biomedical engineers here. Usually it was biomed that goes around and goes to the monitors. They had this puck, they call it, and because it looked like a hockey puck. And you put them on the screen and they would change the light output and they would measure it on a regular basis. Now, here's the good news. We don't have to do that many times, assuming we have a medical grade monitor, because they're auto-calibrated. If you look carefully next time when you look at a monitor, there's a good chance that you might see a little black sticking out thing in the corner. And then if you really look well, then there's actually a light meter that constantly monitors the output. So for manual calibration, we actually went to a continuous calibration. Now, of course, you still need to monitor it, and that's where the calibration software comes in, right? So most monitors are packaged with calibration software. You can log into it and you can see, how many hours the monitor in, where are we in the calibration curve, when should we replace it? So there's still a need for monitoring, but the manual labor kind of doing the measurement of, having the different light outputs, typically they would have like 25 or 30 different steps in light output, and then automatically the software would interpolate between these measuring points and create, the correct curve. But so calibration and auto calibration critical, right? Some states, actually here, I live in Texas, and they actually require still for Memo to calibrate automatically every week. Now, I know it's depending on different states and different countries, different regulation. And Memo is more stringent than, for example, chest or general X-ray. But so calibration is the key. I want to mention one thing about this calibration. The calibration data is actually archived somewhere in a file. When you upgrade your monitors or you upgrade your packs, in many cases, those files are lost. Make sure you keep those. I was an expert witness in one case, and in that case, the radiologist argued that the monitor was not working correctly, and that's why he missed the diagnosis. And they asked me in court, is that possible? And I said, well, listen, here's the calibration file. At that time, and it was at 12 o'clock midnight somewhere in Nevada, that monitor was perfectly a calibration. So the argument that the radiologist made, this is not, was not calibrated, and also could be used in a different way to protect yourself. So PACS administrators, anybody that is in charge of managing a PACS, keep the calibration files, save them, not only save them, but make sure that they're carried over when some of the software has been changed. So Jeff, anything about calibration? I know you've spent a lot of time doing this manual work in the field. What are some of your experience?
Well, first, you mentioned a couple things, Herman. Yeah, and definitely on your last point about keeping the logs, I definitely agree 100% on that. So, we always recommend to keep those logs as well. And also, I mean, there's different ways to, of course, do any sort of quality control, whether it's on displays or on the imaging modality itself. But, we always usually recommend to do the calibrations and do the visual checks, I should say, which are weekly here in Ontario where I am, and do that through the calibration software itself. And that automatically keeps a nice log. It reduces the amount of button clicking that the radiologist needs to do. They're very busy people. We understand that. So, the less work we can make them do, which of course, some sort of work needs to be done to keeping in accordance with quality control requirements we like to recommend. You also mentioned about manual versus automated calibration. So, of course, in mammography, it needs to be done on really a medical grade display and 5 megapixel or even higher. But, for non-mammal stuff, we still see a lot of radiologists that, will read, on a non-medical display, so a commercial off-the-shelf display. And, that might be acceptable. It might not be. But, I think it's really important for the radiologist or end users to sort of understand what they might be getting themselves into as well before they make a purchase or before they start to use it. So, typically the commercial displays, they're not as bright as medical grade displays. They don't have the internal sensor to do the auto calibration. So that's really where there's some extra work that needs to be done in terms of manually calibrating the display properly to the DICOM. We call it GSDF, or the grayscale standard display function curve. That calibration I've seen, it's not usually as stable as with medical grade displays. So, say for a medical grade display, in Texas, I know Herman, you had said you have to calibrate, I think you said every week. Some jurisdictions may be a little bit less frequent. Here in Ontario, we don't necessarily need to calibrate to a certain frequency, but I usually recommend what the New York State standards are. And I think those were, at least at some point, at least every year, to do a full calibration. So I always like to make, the reference to my clients that this is sort of like bringing your vehicle in, changing your oil. So, you're taking out, draining the oil, putting in new oil. And then of course, when they dip the stick in, they come back to your vehicle and they ask you, does this oil look good? Is it clean? That's sort of your quick and dirty. Of course, it's clean, but quick and dirty sort of spot check. Did we actually do what we did? Is this oil actually replaced now? So that's another one of the checks that needs to be done after a calibration. A lot of manufacturers, depending on the software, call it a conformance or a DICOM compliance test. So it's not a calibration, but it's sort of a spot check at different gray levels, going from black to white, to see if it follows that specific DICOM curve. So that's sort of the analogy I make. But yeah, I do see, or I do like to make radiologists aware that, in terms of calibration, in terms of stability, in terms of how uniform the backlight is, all things like that, that commercial displays versus medical displays are definitely inferior. I never say do not use it or use it. I always leave that up to the end user or customer or client. But I think, once you inform someone properly, they can make an educated and informed decision afterwards.
Jeff, what I typically do is, and you can elaborate a little bit more on that in the APM test pattern, but so there's an APM test pattern that basically shows in the different grayscale values the difference between, one grayscale value. I always tell the radiologist, look at that pattern and say, take a look at that, at this area here, right here in this corner. Do you see any differences? And then if they say, well, you don't, I don't. And then say, well, what if there was a microcalcification, or maybe even a better example would be a pneumothorax. So that means if you had a pneumothorax with the same grayscale differences, you would miss it, period. Right? And is that something that you want to be responsible for with your patients? So I think having a test pattern would often help to convince a radiologist and say, listen, if you're going to see this difference in grayscale values, right, it's supposed to be there because, and then you can share the same test pattern on a medical grade monitor. Actually, in my training class, I would actually have a commercial monitor, grade monitor, and a medical grade monitor next to each other, and we show the same test pattern on both. And you say, look left and look right. And do you see a significant difference? And I go, yeah, nah, I don't see the difference in this area in the grayscale value. I said, well, you're going to miss information. So I think sometimes it takes a little bit of a convincing and almost like proof. Hey, look at this. You don't see what you're supposed to see. And so do you want to, put the job or the life of the patients in jeopardy? So I think using test patterns could be very useful for that. By the way, some people ask, why do we still talk about monitors? Because in hospitals, people really typically know what's going on and the minister, but particularly with teleradiology, a lot of people read from home. That the whole discussion came up. And when I work in, lower income countries, when I go to Africa, now everybody's reading off a commercial grade monitor. It's not that expensive. If you think about $50,000, for a portable X-ray, buy a 2 megapixel medical grade monitor, which is a few $1,000s. You don't have to go for the 5 megapixel, 10 megapixel. Because if you have a 2 megapixel medical grade monitor, you can always zoom it up. Now, it's a no-no when we talk, in the United States, because they want 5 megapixels. They don't want to do another 5 mouse clicks to be able to see the full resolution. But for countries where, labor is less expensive than equipment, use a medical grade monitor. And if you cannot afford it, go to a lower resolution and use the zoom button and the pans button, because remember, a memo is 20, 30, 40 megapixel. There's not a single monitor today almost that can display the inherent resolution anyway. You have to manipulate it anyway to see it full pixel by pixel. So okay, yeah, Jeff, anything to comment or?
Yeah, no, I agree with what you said. I know it looks like Prasant has been patiently wanted to ask a question, so maybe we'll turn it over to him for a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, no worries. You guys were going. I didn't want to stop you. It was actually a question about talking about calibration. And so I have my PAX workstation in front of me, and I see the little outdentation from the bezel. And my question is thinking about statistics and whatnot. We have sampling error or sampling biases because, when we go to take a biopsy of a tumor or lesion, right? Is it possible that you missed the actual cancer cells because you only biopsied in one specific spot and didn't take a good representative sample from the top, the middle, and the bottom? So the question then becomes, okay, well, I have this light sensor in one spot. Mm-hmm. Does that provide, and then I understand there's the calibration software and everything else, but you could make the argument that all the rest of the display, except that one spot, has degraded and it's giving a false positive. How do we account for that without doing manual calibration?
So, I think there's a couple things to say about that is that, obviously this is sort of better than nothing. And where else would the manufacturers possibly put the sensor, I guess is my question if I was sort of on their end of things. So it's not a perfect system, but also I believe most medical grade displays, if not all, have technology to sort of ensure the background brightness of the background light is uniform over all areas. So whether they put it in one corner or the other, or something sort of drops down from the middle and goes right to the middle center of the display, hypothetically, I think it's just sort of an engineering aspect more than anything about where you're going to actually place that sensor, thinking about it a little bit more.
Yeah, I remember when we did the manual calibration, we always did it in the center.
Yeah.
So now we do it in the corner. So I think the mechanism is kind of the same. But I think you bring up a good point, Prasant, because, we're looking at the background brightness. But for example, we don't measure pixel dropouts. And so I don't know how frequent pixel dropouts are. I think it's more, and I'm not an expert in manufacturing, but I think it's more, if a pixel is broken, it's mostly happens during the manufacturing process. And there are very strict rules. As a matter of fact, every display has a couple of dropouts, actually. So what they do, they find it and they fuse it together with the neighbor. But if there are too many, then it would automatically be ejected. It would be a QA process. So, but again, there are other artifacts. So if you always see a big spot in somewhere in the center that doesn't go away, even if you have different images being displayed. He said, "Okay, oh, there's something else going on with my monitor. Maybe you should ask somebody." But you're right. But I think, like Jeff said, it's pretty. Whether it's in the corner or the center, it should be a representation of where the overall quality of the screen is going. So, and actually, interestingly enough, some of the big radiology practices in here in the United States that I'm familiar with, they actually have a regular, it's like changing the fluorescent tubes in offices. They change it every 3 years, and then and they might look and say, they're still okay, but they just want to make sure they have a regular basis. After 3 years, we replace them all. And some of those monitors, if they're not used that much, they can actually go for another 2 or 3 years. And maybe somebody might want to use it in a teleology setting, or I know some of them are donated to Africa where they can still have a use. And they can. There's not definitely nothing wrong with it, because as long as they're in calibration, they're perfectly fine. Right? So calibration actually means you actually adjust that curve to still make sure that that you map all of the pixel values that are part, all the grayscale values into a human visible, representation. We call it just noticeable differences, JNDs. So basically all the pixel values are mapped into a grayscale value that somebody can see the difference between that and the next one up. This is actually very, very, very good concept, very, very cool concept. So we haven't really talked, I don't know, Jeffrey, what else, but I wanted to make sure we talk also a little bit about color, because that comes up a lot. Jeff, why don't you start with that maybe, unless you have anything else to add.
No, I just thank you. I just wanted to jump in and mention a quick word or two about the sensor as well. So I think it's very important and essential to know that upon purchase or upon, first installing the displays, whether they're used or brand new, we see both here, is that those internal bezels or sensors are cross-calibrated at the factory, whether that's, and we're not biased to any manufacturer, but if that's Barco or ISA or whoever, but those are cross-calibrated to an external device. And we call it device a photometer, so it measures light. So what happens over time is that it's cross-calibrated at the factory, shipped into the box, into a home or a clinic. So if you're calibrating to say a maximum luminance, that's a fancy word for brightness essentially, of say 500 or 600 candela per square meter, that's the units we use in terms of luminance for calibration, then you might get very close to that if you put an external puck or external photometer on your display afterwards. And it really should be within that percentage. But over time, because that bezel is only cross-calibrated, even though the software thinks that it's calibrating to 500 or 600 candela per square meter, over time, as Herman said, the brightness of the display will decrease over time. So you might have to calibrate more frequently as well to reach that 500. But as with any piece of technology, as one thing ages, it'll just degrade over time. So, even though it still says 500 at 5, 6, even 10 years, which I've even seen 12 or 13-year-old displays, believe it or not, if you put an external device on the display, you will definitely not be measuring anywhere close to 5 or 600 candela per square meter. At that point, you can definitely, there is some flexibility in various standards in terms of calibration. We can get into this later. So there is a little bit of wiggle room in terms of how much flexibility there is to calibrate in terms of the brightness settings and luminance ratio. We can talk about that after maybe. But I think it's important to know that sensor is cross-calibrated and its performance will deviate away from what you think it's saying over time.
We should talk a little bit about color because that's a topic that comes up as well. Now, going back to color, almost all color displays, So first of all, we had grayscale and color a long time ago, but today, it's basically all color. And if you look at a grayscale, it's really a special case of a color monitor. But color used to be just pseudo color, right? If you see a 3D representation of a CT 3D, and you see the bone kind of white. Well, remember, X-ray is grayscale. You measure attenuation. You cannot really look inside your body using an X-ray or CT scan and say, okay, this is red or this is blue or this is whatever, right? So almost all of the color initially was what we call pseudo-color. They assign a color in a certain palette. Or it would be like when we use Doppler ultrasound, would be either red or blue. That means, the one or the other direction of where the bloodstream is going. And so you could then detect, if you look at the heart, you do a cardiac echo, whether there's some backflow going on, things like that. However, where is color very important? Well, it started to be in nuclear medicine. Because when you do nuclear medicine, you measure intake, you measure activity. And so if something is yellow or red, that's a huge difference, right? And so we want to make sure that what we see on the nuclear medicine camera display on color, that we also see it on the PACS display. And that's why actually some of the DICOM images actually provide a color lookup table in the metadata, in the header itself, to make sure that it is consistently displayed. However, we need to make sure, of course, that the display is color calibrated. Yeah. So nuclear medicine, color is very important. And now with the pathology, of course, because what is one of the big applications in pathology? The pathology staining. Well, staining, it really makes a big difference if you stain a slide, whether something is purple or red or blue or whatever it is, right? So color becomes certainly a very hot topic in medical displays, mostly for nuclear medicine and pathology. So Jeff, have you come across some color displays and how do you deal with this?
No, actually, we usually deal with a lot of home or other radiologists inside the clinic as well, but none with color. I do see in my experience, Barco actually, and again, not the side with any make or anything, but we do see some of the barcode displays that have the color, and of course with their software, and they have their settings to calibrate to. I believe, just like the GSDF grayscale standard display function, I believe that Barco actually, they were big players in developing what's known as the color standard display function. So when we talk about the GSDF, we look for basically mapping those pixels to light in a linear fashion. We have this concept called perceptual linearization, is that, if you have equal changes in pixels, then you should have equal changes in perceived luminance or brightness, essentially. So that color standard display function is something that I believe at least Barco implements, that I'm not sure if any other manufacturers do as well, but that aims to sort of do the same type of job to linearize the luminance values across the color gamut.
Yeah, and actually it's interesting because these color mapping were really, really old already, because in printing, we needed to have a standard anyway, because just like I always give the example, let's say People's Magazine has to be printed worldwide. We need to have a version in New York City that's being printed, one in LA, and maybe in Ontario, maybe one in Tokyo. And we want to make sure that the skin tone of Britney Spears on the front page was exactly the same, coming out of these printers. So there's an ICC profile, International Color something standard, that was already defined for printing. And so DICOM really had to just say, okay, let's take this color standard that is used in the printing industry for a while and let's adapt that. And so we can apply that to what I see then on my monitor in color is the same thing. What I see in my monitor in color. And of course, for graphical designers, they want to do, if somebody is a graphic designer and they would, design the front page again of People's Magazine or whatever, they want to make sure that what they see on the screen is the same as coming out of the printer. So yeah, color is important, particularly for digital pathology. And then I think so when you're, I know some of the hospitals are thinking about enterprise, wide packs, and they're thinking about digital pathology. Make sure that the monitors that you're using for that purpose are also color calibrated. Otherwise, there will not be a good representation of the digital slides on your monitor.
I know our grayscale monitors are 12-bit grayscale, right? Do we know if the color portion is also 12-bit color, or is it 8-bit? I was just kind of curious if they, to maintain the, along the same linearity, is it 12-bit red RGB, or is it 8-bit kind of thing? Do we know?
I think they are. I think when I've looked at a couple of other papers and standards that I believe, color was calibrated at least, maybe for Barco's, per the color standard display function, which again, Barco had to play in, that I do believe they're calibrated to 12 bits as well. So yeah. I also think, on the issue of, sort of number of bits in terms of calibration, it's sort of interesting to discuss a little bit about, that even with for grayscale, for the GSD app, we calibrate to 12-bit depth, but the human visual system can only see up to about 8 bits. So that's about, I think, 256 shades of gray across the whole dynamic range. So, if you calibrate to something higher than 8 bits, yes, there is more, you're basically breaking up that dynamic range into essentially more shades of gray. So there possibly might be able to see more subtle features, but on the average, that's really what it comes down to when we talk about, the human visual system, that on the average that no, generally we might not be able to see, or we don't expect to necessarily see those subtle changes, but it's possible.
We didn't really talk about pitch and, and things like that. When you look at the setup of the monitors in a reading room, you always want to be kind of perpendicular to a display and some of the displays do a better job than others. But if you look sideways, and you've seen that, or for example, some displays do that on purpose. If you take a plane ride and you look sideways to this little monitor of your neighbor, you see very little, right? So that actually is probably the best example of the worst pitch you can imagine. But they do that on purpose because you don't want to be distracted by your neighbors looking at a movie that are different than your own. But it's really important to be as perpendicular as possible, because as soon as you start moving away to that perpendicular axis, you miss information. Ideally, you would actually have a screen that is circular based, or if you have multiple screens, you would move them, so that they always perpendicular. And that's why I kind of, thought it was always kind of weird that you have this new 12 megapixel displays, but there's two screens, but they're flat. I would thought that they might want to put a little fold in the middle, you know what I mean? But because it's really hard, because you always have to go from left and move your chair a little bit to the right. So be aware of that pixel pitch. Jeff, how do you see the most of the setups in practice, in your practices, Jeff?
Well, certainly we still see, like I said, we deal with a lot of mammography clients. So, they obviously have to read on at least 2 sets of 5 megapixels. We do see probably about 2/3 of my clients still have the 1 set of displays, 2 displays side by side. I always recommend as well, on your note about having the displays, is say if it was a single display, ideally curved, Sometimes we could ask questions. Sometimes I like to nerd out a little bit and kind of say, well, why is that? Or if they have the display side by side, why should you kind of fold it in maybe, a few degrees or so? And that's actually described quite well for those SID members in the practical imaging informatics textbook, is that we actually see the highest amount of fine detail, of fine spatial resolution at the center of the eye. So you can make the argument that because the eyes look out and everything diverges, if you sort of fold in a little bit, that you can sort of concentrate that detail onto the center of the eye, just that extra little bit. So, and it potentially reduces how much sort of moving around the radiologists have to do. We do see definitely a lot more clients, more or less in hospitals, clinics, not so much. We really don't see displays in the clinics anymore so much. Everyone's reading from home, especially post-COVID, right? That's sort of the times. But we do definitely see a lot more 10 and 12 megapixel displays. There is one manufacturer that, well, a couple now actually, that has some 8 megapixel displays, which really, when you break it down and you open up images in a PACS viewer, you are essentially reading on one set of 4 megapixels. So you have that sort of line down the middle. So generally, radiologists I see are very happy with those, whether it's the single display or sort of the dual set of displays. And at least from my perspective, I don't really hear anything in terms of too much complaining, let's say, between sort of the dual set or the single set. But I think ultimately it's really up to the radiologist's preference on what they like. The one thing I do like to mention as well, for, like I said, we do deal with a lot of, especially home mammography radiologists, is that if they do decide to get specifically the 8 megapixel display and reading mammograms on that, really they are reading on one set of sort of 2 sides of 4 megapixel displays when you sort of break it down the middle. So potentially we want at least 5 megapixels. The pixel pitch, which is basically how large those pixel sizes are, is still going to be about the same. But really what it means, possibly from an efficiency standpoint for a radiologist, is that you might have to do a little bit more panning around the image, especially in mammography, because the images are so pixel dense. So that might affect your workflow a little bit and sort of, increase the amount of reading time. So again, I think making sure they have informed, they can be educated so that they can make informed decisions is always the best approach.
One thing I wanted to mention, and that has actually nothing to do with monitors, but it has to do with the capability of a human to adapt to different light environments. And then I always give the example of my good friend. He always talks about his experience in Houston, where most of the radiologists, they live west of town, and when they come in the morning, so in their car, they're watching to see the sun in the eyes. And in this particular hospital, they do not allow the radiologists to read for the first half hour, really mammo or really diagnostic. Really interesting, because you have to be realize that, and you know that by yourself, we go from a light to a black environment. It takes about a half an hour for your eye and your human visible system to really adapt to the darker environment and see all the subtle changes in the dark, right? And then I think the same applies if you have a radiologist and he just came from, I don't know, special procedure, bright room, this and this, bright light, and then he walks into the dark room where the dark. Make sure that you're aware of the fact that your human visual system might not be able to detect all the small differences. So nothing to do with monitors. Actually, you could, if you want to, maybe crank up the maximum brightness of the display a little bit, but I wouldn't recommend that. But so it's not only it's a system. It's an interaction between your human visual system, what you can perceive, and the monitor itself. And you need to make sure that that's in sync.
Herman, I want to ask a maybe tangential question, because you mentioned the human here. And one of the things I'm wondering about is, what do modern monitors, this is a question for both Herman and Jeff, what do they do for the people who use them? Like, for example, are there features to help reduce eye strain and things like that?
So in terms of, reducing eye strain, I've always been telling my clients and say that really to reduce eye strain, primarily you want to focus on a couple things. And again, when the displays come right out of the box, they're maximized for the highest, what we call the contrast ratio. So that means we're going to we talk about the dynamic range. So black sort of being sort of the minimum brightness and white being sort of the maximum brightness or luminance, where out of the box, the maximum brightness is the highest where it can be, and the minimum brightness is the lowest it can go. So the ratio of those two numbers is essentially the highest it can be. It's maximized. So, but I say it's really important to calibrate not only to the DICOM GSDF, but you don't want your maximum brightness to be driven at the maximum brightness, because that'll degrade the backlight use over time and you'll have to replace your display sooner. So if you say, out of the box, a lot of the monitors are getting better and better and brighter. So they might come factory calibrated at say, 1,000 or 1,200 candela per square meter. That's going to be very bright. Most radiologists don't need it that bright. You might get a couple that you might have to fight over it. And I've been in those, nothing about it if I swear, but those discussions as well. But usually I can get away with, bringing that down to about a factor of 2. So 500 or 600 candela per square meter. That's one aspect that helps with visual eye strain, first of all. The other aspect is saying, to the radiologist to not read inside a very dark environment. So as I said before, some sort of ambient light, the AACR, AEPM SIN document, as I mentioned before, they have a recommendation for about, I think it's 25 to 70 or 75 lux, which is basically the surrounding ambient light in the room. Of course, you want to make sure that any additional light sources that one puts in the room are not directly facing the display. Otherwise, you'll get glare, you'll decrease the amount of perceived contrast and resolution that you can see. So a little bit of surrounding light is good. Again, when you're looking at the display, when you're looking sort of around the room, at your shoes, at the keyboard, you really want to sort of minimize those light changes just to downgrade how much visual strain there is.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I don't have really anything to add. I'm not an ergonomic specialist, but I know people are working on it. But you're right, eye strain is not only for radiologists, it's for me and you, for us geek people that watch monitors all day. It's similar, right?
I have a two-part question. I was speaking with my PACS administrator, and he was saying that in his experience, people don't like reading on 4K monitors. And I was thinking about it, and I'm like, well, the resolution should be there as long as it fits the DICOM standards. That should be fine. So why not? And we're bouncing around some ideas, and he thought maybe be the pixel pitch, but I wasn't sure. And I wanted to get your ideas on why people might not like reading on 4K monitors. And also, how does one translate a 4K monitor into megapixels or vice versa? Or is 4 megapixels same as 4K? Or that's something I've not been able to really find enough information online, and maybe I'm not looking in the right spots. So because we have to be able to communicate this to the people that don't necessarily know as much about monitors so that they understand what the differences are.
When we talk about megapixels, it's really million pixels. So if you think about this, it's simple, the width times the height. So let's say 2000 by 2500 is 5 megapixels, right? 5 million pixels. I'm not sure what they mean with 4K will be 4000. What that means. Jeff, any idea?
Yeah, I think that's, and you were sort of getting towards there, Herman, where, displays are characterized not only by pixel pitch, but number of megapixels. It's very easy math, so nothing scary, but the way the number of megapixels is essentially calculated, at least an approximation, is multiplying the number of pixels along the height of the display and along the width. So basically, it's the number of pixels along the height and width. So it's just basic multiplication. So that 4K display, I think, is the highest or the largest number, whether it be along the height or the width. And I believe that's usually along the width. So a 4K display would be, maybe 4,000 and some by 2,000 or 3,000 some. And, that number is going to be the total number of megapixels, approximately.
No. So one of the reasons, so if you have a lower resolution, let's say take 2 megapixel, right? It's much less expensive, much cheaper. And actually it's not the really standard. Most hospitals have at least 3 megapixels for chest and then 5 for mammo. But from a user perspective, from a radiologist perspective, assuming, let's say you would have a 2 megapixel, And if it's the same medical grade monitor, it's just calibrated, you have to do an extra step. You have to zoom it up to see the full resolution, right? So I would very likely, I would suspect that radiologists don't like the lower resolution monitors because it's more work for them. Because they're busy anyway. They want to read fast, to do zoom up and pan. Versus if you have a higher resolution, you're closer to the real pixels that are part of the images. Now again, remember a mammogram, for example, might be 40 megapixel, 40, instead of 4. So the inherent resolution of these images are still much higher. So if you really want to see pixel for pixel, right, then you still have to zoom up anyway. But then you can become almost like noisy. So I think that's probably the reason why radiology like the higher the better. The latest and greatest, Shiraz name was 32 megapixels. They're not cheap. Maybe it's worth an extra mouse click instead of paying another $10,000 or more. Yeah. But that's not for me to decide. It's for the radiologist.
Technology, sort of always improving and getting better and better. It really takes an educated individual or individuals, whether that be the informatics information professional, medical physicist, whoever, consultant, doesn't matter, but to really sort of know what standards there are, but also have that practical experience too. So what technology does the display use, or does the manufacturer claim that it uses? The number of megapixels, the pixel pitch, and sort of cutting through whatever needs to be cut through to sort of, really digest and understand, is this 32 megapixel display, is it really worth it? Is the cost really justified per se, right? So as Herman
I
mentioned
should
as well.
really add any value. So just as a kind of funny story, my neighbor, he used to showed me his biggest, latest and greatest TV that he just bought. I don't know how many inches of diameter, more than 60, and he has a really small living room. And I think, well, you don't see anything more than on the 40 something because you will start seeing the pixels. So how good is good enough? He doesn't see. I see the same quality on my smaller screen than he see on his big screen, sitting with his nose almost close up. And it almost would be hard to. Sometimes you go to the movie theater. Sometimes you have to move your head, your left to the right, to really follow the whole scene. The more as you go to the front, the worse it gets. So I don't know. It's sometimes you have to determine what is good enough, and what can you afford.
So, gentlemen, this has been a lovely discussion. I've learned a ton today. It's not an area of expertise for me. Unfortunately, though, the flip side is we're also running out of time. So I want to thank you both for your time so much. I'll also ask you if you have any closing thoughts or calls to action that you want to give. Maybe we'll start with you, Herman. We go to Jeff.
I still think, I think when we started talking about monitors, it's kind of it doesn't come to the forefront. You don't hear about it anymore. I mean, and then I think it's still a very important topic, first of all, because of the increase in teleradiology users. And then, of course, the whole color, issues that come with distal pathology, and also more and more deployments of PAC systems in countries that are just going digital, such as Africa, Latin America, whatever. So I think it's a very important topic, and I'm really glad and pleased that we can give a little bit, shed a little bit of light on this technology and keep it to the forefront. And hey, listen, monitors are important. So appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, I'd say I think my sort of closing thoughts might be, whether you're, for a radiologist or a facility, hopefully you would purchase medical grade displays for, the reasons that we listed today. But, at bare minimum, I would say, for anyone that's going to be involved in the purchasing or maintenance decision making, and the end user should know as well, is to really go through and read and really understand that ACR, AEPM, and SIM document on the electronic standard for medical imaging. There's a lot of good stuff there, a lot of good material. That may be guidance, it may be recommendations, but you have really three big players there. So, I think they really tie in a lot of other standards that they reference throughout the document. So, the information is not just coming from nowhere, is what I'm saying. So I would really say that the displays that are purchased, ideally medical grade, maybe commercial, should at least conform to those standards as best as possible.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. Appreciate your time and expertise here today. I have a hunch this is going to be a very popular episode with our audience. I'm pretty sure a lot of people are wondering about the same thing here too. So thanks again.
Simcast has been brought to you by the Society of Imaging Informatics and Medicine. Please visit our website at siim.org for more information and educational content, including webinars and an archive of prior episodes. Please follow us on Twitter at sim_tweets. Thank you to our listeners for your continued support.